When I made the decision to leave the military, I never imagined the impact it would have on those around me. What was a difficult but necessary choice for me became a story of failure for everyone who knew me. The words I dreaded hearing began to spread like wildfire, and the pain of being seen as a deserter consumed me, even though I hadn't actually given up on anything. In truth, my decision was just the beginning of something much bigger, but no one knew it at the time. To the world, I had failed. To me, I was beginning the most important journey of my life. Those with whom I shared my story were in shock. Friends I considered close looked at me with disappointment, as if I had done something unforgivable. My parents, with whom I had always dreamed of achieving greatness, remained silent. Nothing I said seemed to justify what was happening. Gradually, I realized that for others, leaving the army was not a choice, but an escape. "You gave up," they said. "You couldn't handle the weight," I heard repeatedly. This became the label I would carry. Deserter. Failure. At that moment, the words began to sink into my mind. Every conversation, every judgmental look made me feel like I was in the wrong, like I had done something wrong, like I was the flaw in the system. I, who had always been strong, who always knew what I wanted, suddenly found myself lost in a sea of criticism. The feeling of being seen as someone who had shirked responsibility felt like a huge weight on my shoulders. It was as if my own story was being rewritten by everyone around me, and I was the villain. The criticism came not only from outside, but also from within. I wondered if I had truly failed, if my choice was an irreparable mistake. What would my life be like from this point on? How could I move forward knowing everyone was telling me I was a failure? I tried to keep my head held high, but the truth is that every word, every disapproving look shook me deeply. When you're seen as someone who's abandoned everything you fought for, it's hard to believe in yourself. I wanted to be stronger. I wanted to prove that I was still capable. But how could I do that when everyone was convinced I was nothing more than a desertion of what they expected of me? It was at this moment that the ghosts of failure began to become real. Every time someone called me a deserter, I felt a weight on my chest. What happened to the person who once seemed to have all the answers? Where had my confidence gone? I didn't know. The words of those around me seeped into my mind, and I began to question whether I had, in fact, lost the most important battle, the battle against my own perception. And it was precisely at this point, when everyone was convinced I had given up, that my true mission began to take shape. No one knew it, but what seemed like a desperate exit was actually a meticulously planned strategy. What I had left behind was not a failure, but a sacrifice. What I was about to do, no one could have imagined, and frankly, I didn't know what to expect either. But I knew my mission had a purpose far greater than anything I could explain to them at that moment. And most importantly, I knew that this purpose wasn't about pleasing anyone or proving anything to the world. But as time passed, the pain of the words that called me a failure became more bearable. As the years passed, the weight of those criticisms slowly began to fade, not because others forgave me, but because I finally understood something much bigger. The label of deserter no longer made me feel small. What seemed like a failure in the eyes of others revealed itself to be a unique opportunity that only I could understand. I knew that the journey I was about to embark on would be the greatest of my life, and when I returned years later, with a story of success and quiet honor, I no longer needed anyone's words of comfort or validation. This story others told about my failure wasn't my story. It was just a temporary chapter, a distorted vision of what was to come. The biggest mistake of all was thinking that what seemed like a withdrawal was actually preparation. I wasn't abandoning the battlefield. I was positioning myself for something much bigger, something only I knew was happening. And one day, everyone would know. That's how I learned that the labels people place on you aren't your truth. They're just stories people create to explain what they don't understand. But deep down, what matters isn't what others think of your journey. but what you become when you refuse to give up, even when the whole world tells you you failed. My mission was just beginning, and the true test would come when I returned, with quiet honor, to show the world that what seemed like a way out was actually the greatest beginning of my life. The decision to leave the army wasn't taken lightly, much less was it an impulsive choice. For anyone who'd never experienced the pressure of being in such an environment, it seems incomprehensible that someone like me, at the height of my military career, with everything I ever wanted within my reach, would choose to give it all up. But the reality was different. What seemed like a foolish decision, an escape, was actually a path I knew I had to follow, even without knowing the details of where it would lead. I'd always had a strong sense of duty, a burning desire to serve, to be part of something bigger than myself. But as time passed, a growing feeling began to build within me, something I couldn't ignore. It was like an internal pressure, something deep inside me that told me that what I was doing, however noble, wasn't allowing me to grow. I was increasingly disconnected from myself, from who I wanted to be, from who I truly was. In the army, life was guided by rigid rules, orders from above that I followed without question. But over time, I realized that following these orders, as much as it was my obligation, was no longer in line with what I expected of my life. The dilemma began to form silently, but with overwhelming intensity. I felt like the army was consuming me from the inside out. And the truth is, as much as the idea of serving excited me, I also felt lost in a cycle of responsibilities that didn't reflect my own desires. The life I led in the army was one of discipline, focus, and a constant sacrifice of my identity to fulfill the mission. Sometimes I questioned whether it was all worth it. If, at some point, the person I became inside was truly who I wanted to be. Even though everyone around me had high expectations for me, that I would make a career and excel in the military, the truth was that I was starting to feel suffocated. I didn't want to be the perfect soldier just because that was what was expected of me. I wanted to be more. I wanted to discover my true purpose, something unconstrained by the confines of hierarchy or the daily conflicts of the battlefield. And it was at this point that the internal struggle began. I knew I needed something more. The responsibility that came with my position was immense, and the expectations of who I should be as a soldier were constantly upon me. But at the same time, I felt I needed to find my own path, something that would allow me to discover who I truly was outside the uniform, outside the rigidity of the army. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself, couldn't keep living the life expected of me without knowing who I truly was deep down. It would consume me, making me lose the essence of who I'd always been. I was becoming a version of what others wanted, not what I aspired to be. That's when the opportunity to leave arose. And at the same time, something that felt like a premonition began to grow within me. There was something bigger happening, something I couldn't ignore. I didn't yet know what it was, but the feeling that my journey was about to change took hold of me. The dilemma was whether to follow my heart or continue on. The path of duty. But what drove me to this decision wasn't just dissatisfaction with my life in the army. Something else was about to reveal itself. A greater mission that would become the reason for this entire decision. The tension between my desire to pursue my personal life and the responsibility of something greater was the true driving force behind my decision. I knew that leaving the army wasn't simply abandonment. In a way, it was like giving up a secure life to take an unknown risk, with no guarantee of success. Leaving the army meant abandoning the stability, structure, and security it provided me. But at the same time, I knew that if I didn't make that decision, I would always feel like I was missing something much greater, something I needed to find my true purpose. The army taught me discipline, to follow rules, to stay in line. But something vital was missing. My truth. I was at a point where I could no longer ignore this void. And so it was that, with a whirlwind of conflicting feelings, I made the decision to leave the army. I knew the exit would be difficult, that criticism would come, that words of disapproval would be harsh. But I also knew that without this choice, I would never discover what truly lay in store for me. The dilemma was not easy to resolve, but deep down, I knew that the mission I was about to embrace would be something far greater than anything I had experienced before. And with that, the door to the unknown opened, and I set off toward something no one could have imagined. I left behind a structured life, where every step was known, and walked into the unknown, where the risk was great, but the reward could be even greater. At that moment, I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had made the right decision, that my destiny was about to be shaped by something beyond my control. I knew my mission wouldn't be about me, but about something much greater, something that required courage, something that required sacrifice. And I was willing to take that step, without looking back. Now, years later, I realized that that decision, that internal dilemma, was the first step toward something much greater. The mission I didn't know I was about to embark on began when I took that first step into the unknown, while everyone thought I'd given up. The real reason I left the army in the end wasn't weakness or lack of willpower, but because something much greater was calling me, something I would need to experience to understand. When I made the decision to leave the army, I knew the consequences would be dire. What I didn't expect was the reaction of everyone around me. The reaction was not just surprise, but disbelief, and often mockery. People I considered friends, superiors, and even family quickly turned my departure into a spectacle. To them, the decision to leave the army made no sense at all. They saw the army as an honor, a privilege, something to be defended to the end. To them, I was breaking a sacred line, and that line had no explanation. What seemed like a sensible choice, however painful, turned out to be the most misunderstood and ridiculed choice of my life. At first, the words were subtle, little whispers among the hallways, quick glances as I passed. But over time, the mockery took on a more aggressive tone. "Oh, you can't take it anymore? All that pressure got you down, huh?" Someone commented quietly, but loud enough for everyone around me to hear. That was just the beginning. Gradually, my decision became everyone's favorite topic, and with each new comment, the shame crept deeper and deeper into me. "You don't have the courage to move on. You couldn't handle it." These were the words that echoed in my ears. Everyone seemed to have an opinion on my choice, but none of them were positive. Among my coworkers, the situation was even more difficult. They were the people I'd spent days and nights with in training camp, the same ones who'd watched me lead missions and fulfill my responsibilities. To them, I was an exemplary soldier. I believed they would understand that my departure was a difficult choice, but the only one that made sense for me. But instead, I found myself surrounded by looks of disappointment. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. I was the person who always gave my best, the person who always followed protocol and did everything right. And now I was breaking everything, throwing away everything that seemed to be my career, built with sweat and dedication. The doubt in their eyes was impossible to ignore. When someone known for their strength and dedication decides to take a step back, the reactions aren't just about the choice itself, but about the impact it has on those around them. My departure from the army didn't just represent a personal change. It meant I was jeopardizing something everyone around me valued: respect, loyalty, and the ability to resist. I wasn't just changing my life. I was changing everyone's perception of me. I was a stumbling block to their vision of the order and discipline the army represented. This change was not welcome. I was challenging a norm, a system that everyone, including myself, had always respected. The external pressure intensified as the weeks and months passed. Close friends began to doubt my choices, and what had once been conversations about future projects and shared dreams now turned into uncomfortable silences or veiled criticism. "Did you really do this? Did you know the army is your life and you're throwing it all away?" a longtime friend asked. with the expression of someone about to accuse me of making an irreversible mistake. Those words were like a sharp knife, stabbing me in the chest. I knew he was disappointed, but I had no idea the weight of his disappointment would be so great. He didn't see what I saw. He didn't understand what I felt. To him, I was simply giving up. But the worst part was my family's judgment. They were so proud of my military career. To them, I was the daughter who was living up to all expectations, who was giving her best to protect her country and serve the greater good. I was proof that their upbringing of discipline and dedication was paying off. And then I decided to leave. Not just leave, but do so abruptly. This, for them, was a profound emotional shock. They couldn't understand. "You're throwing everything away," my mother said, her words coming out in a tone of pain and desperation. I saw the frustration in her eyes, as if she couldn't comprehend what was happening. And I didn't have the right words to explain what had driven me to do this. External pressure not only questioned my decision, but also shaped the way I saw myself. Every comment, every criticism, was a constant reminder of the weight of my choice. I knew that somehow I was breaking the expectations others had of me. They expected me to follow, to stay. They wanted me to be their version of success. And with each new comment of doubt or mockery, the feeling of making the wrong choice intensified. For a moment, I began to question my own sanity. Was I really wrong? Was everyone right? The external pressure, which seemed like something I could ignore at first, was now beginning to sap my strength, making it difficult to believe I had made the right choice. However, the answer I was searching for was hidden deep within my heart. Even when everyone called me a failure, even when the pressure seemed overwhelming, there was something inside me that knew I was heading in the right direction. But I couldn't share this with anyone. No one would know. No one would understand. The underlying reason for my decision, the true reason, was hidden. And no matter how much everyone around me mocked or doubted it, the truth was that no one knew the true reason behind my departure. To them, my decision was simply a mistake. But to me, it was the first step toward something much greater, something I knew would be revealed in time. The external pressure, though painful, further reinforced my decision. Seeing everyone's reaction, I became even more convinced that I was right to take this step. If they couldn't understand, it was because they didn't fully grasp what was happening. I wasn't simply giving up. I was preparing for a more important journey. When everyone laughed, when everyone mocked, I knew I was heading in the right direction. Because deep down, I knew my mission wasn't over. It was just beginning. I just didn't know, back then, that the true mission was far from being revealed. And that's what kept me going, even when the weight of doubt and peer pressure seemed to weigh me down. I knew the future awaited me, and that everything I was doing, all the judgments I was receiving, were just part of a much larger game. And that game, I was about to play. Of course. Let's continue with the next topic. After leaving the army, life as I knew it vanished in an instant. The structure, the discipline, the daily missions. Everything that had been the foundation of my existence was suddenly ripped away. The reality of life outside the army was overwhelming. What many would consider freedom for me was a profound emptiness. I, who had always been accustomed to having a clear purpose, now found myself lost, unsure of what to do or how to fit into the world that seemed to have moved on without me. In the first few days after my discharge, I felt like I was living in a state of suspension. I was no longer a soldier, but I also didn't know how to fully reintegrate into civilian life. The army had been my identity, my motivation, my reason for being. Now, I was without that guiding structure, without the daily rituals that kept me on track. I tried to convince myself that leaving the army was the first step on a new journey, but in reality, I felt like someone who had lost their compass. Every move felt erratic, directionless. I tried to follow in the footsteps of those around me, find a normal job, make friends, rebuild my life. But everything felt empty, as if I were trying to live a life that wasn't mine. That world, so rigidly controlled, where everything had a place and a time, made me feel like anything outside that structure was an attempt to fill a void with something that didn't fit. I went to job interviews, trying to adjust to the rhythm of a life that was no longer mine, and at the same time, I deeply missed the discipline the Army had provided. The times when everything was under control, the clear decisions I had to make, now gave way to a sea of uncertainty. When you've been trained to be unbeatable, when the pressure of each mission becomes part of who you are, dealing with the simplicity and lack of grandiose goals was frustrating. The outside world seemed inefficient, disconnected. Loneliness also became a constant companion. In the Army, even though I was surrounded by people all the time, there was an invisible bond that united us all, each with their own mission, but all with a common goal. Outside the Army, things were different. People were busy with their own lives, their own challenges, and I didn't feel part of it. It wasn't just the physical loneliness, but the lack of a clear purpose. The emptiness was palpable. I was trying to be a normal person, but I felt like a shadow of my former self. I missed the adrenaline rush, the need to solve complex problems in real time. The idea of just living seemed unbearable. And worst of all was the constant doubt. When you spend your entire life in a highly demanding and controlled environment, the simple act of living outside of it feels like a failure. Every day outside the Army reminded me that I was no longer doing it. I was no longer fulfilling a mission. I was no longer making a difference. I constantly questioned whether I had truly done the right thing. Had my departure been a mistake? Was I truly incapable of handling the pressure? These thoughts surfaced at the most unexpected moments, forcing me to grapple with insecurity in a way I never had before. I knew I needed to reinvent myself, but what did it mean to be me without the Army? I had left behind the only life I'd ever known, and now I found myself in a vast, empty field, trying to figure out where I belonged. My identity was lost in a sea of uncertainty, and even the small steps I took toward normal felt unfulfilling, as if they were disconnected from who I truly was. It was also during this period that I began to realize that the difficulty lay not only in dealing with life outside the Army, but in understanding the transformation that was happening within me. For so long, my identity had been shaped by the Army and its rigid discipline. Now I was trying to create something new, but without knowing how, without knowing who I was supposed to be. My first attempt at a new job was one of the most difficult. I found myself in a completely different position, without the same kinds of challenges I was used to. It was as if I was forcing myself into something that no longer fit. Working in a normal role was a radical change. I, who was previously accustomed to making important decisions with immediate impact, now found myself performing repetitive tasks without the excitement or value of the missions I once accomplished. This, on the one hand, was a relief. After all, I no longer had to carry the pressure of a constant mission. But, on the other hand, it made me feel like I was being wasted, as if the best of me had been left behind. The need to find a new purpose became urgent. But how could I find that purpose when I was still recovering from the transition? How could I start over when each new experience seemed to push me further away from who I used to be? The dilemma lay in having to deal with the reality that I could no longer be who I was, but I also didn't know how to be who I wanted to be. The feeling of being lost without direction was stronger than any battle I had ever faced. It was in this moment of fragility that I realized something profound. No matter where you are or what you're doing, the greatest challenge is finding the courage to move forward, even when the world around you doesn't understand your choices. When you abandon a part of your life, as I did when I left the Army, it's impossible not to feel that a part of you has been lost in the process. But at the same time, it's necessary to understand that what seems like a void now is simply the space to build something new. I didn't know what this normal life would be like. But I knew I couldn't stagnate. The road to recovery wouldn't be easy, but it would be necessary. I still had much to learn about who I truly was, and that learning would become my silent mission. Life after the military wouldn't be a simple journey, but I was willing to move forward, even without knowing exactly where I was going. First step was accepting that, as lost as I felt, the journey was just beginning. And that, in itself, was what gave me the strength to keep going. After so long trying to adjust to a normal life, something began to shift within me. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I tried to find peace in civilian life, there was a part of me that could never be fulfilled by mundane things. I constantly felt incomplete, as if something were missing. The truth was, at that moment, I was still in a process of self-discovery, unaware that the greatest secret of my life was about to be revealed. While others thought I was simply trying to move on, away from the army and the constant pressure, the truth was that my departure wasn't an abandonment. The mission I'd left behind, the true reason behind my decision to leave, was still in action. As much as everyone believed I'd failed, there was something much bigger going on behind the scenes. My departure was planned and strategically orchestrated, but no one knew it, not even those who knew me best. I didn't know at the time how or when this mission would unfold. What I knew, deep down, was that the army wasn't the end of the line for me. The decision to leave hadn't been a mistake, but a calculated maneuver, a strategy to put myself in a better position to accomplish something of utmost importance. The secret mission I'd been recruited for was about to be revealed, but the world, including those around me, didn't yet know what was to come. The pressure of living under this big lie, of keeping this secret for so long, was immense. While everyone around me mocked and doubted me, the reality was that I was involved in something no one could understand. The mission I had been chosen for was of utmost importance, something that could not be revealed at any moment. To others, my departure was a weakness, but to me, it was the necessary cover to initiate something that could change the course of things. In many ways, living this lie was painful. It was like carrying a silent burden, a responsibility I knew I had to bear alone. I couldn't share what was happening with anyone, because they wouldn't understand. And at the same time, I couldn't afford to doubt this mission. I knew that what lay ahead was greater than anything I had ever experienced, greater than any battle I had faced on the battlefield. The mission was now my true battlefield. I spent years remaining silent, observing the people around me, trying to fit into a life that was no longer mine. And while I pretended to be at peace, my mind was far away, focused on what was to come. That peace I so desperately sought was never real. I knew something greater was at stake, but I couldn't reveal it to anyone. During this period of transition, as civilian life tried to accept me, the mission remained on the back burner, but it was getting closer and closer to completion. I didn't know when or how the mission would be carried out, but the moment was approaching. When the opportunity finally arose, the mission revealed itself clearly and directly. The operation I had been recruited for was no simple field assignment. It was something extremely delicate and complex, something that required impeccable precision. The secret to my exit had been a strategic maneuver, a cover, a distraction to ensure the mission could be carried out without attracting the attention of those who shouldn't have. Revealing to myself that, in fact, my departure hadn't been a failure, but a preparation for something much greater. The feeling of relief was immediate. I knew the mission was about to come to fruition, and with it, the true reason for my choice would finally be revealed. Everything I had done up until now, all the doubts, all the moments of loneliness and despair, had been part of a grand plan, a plan that was now unfolding before me. And most importantly, I knew that by completing this mission, all the judgments, all the ridicule I'd faced along the way, would lose their meaning. Because in the end, what others thought of me wasn't what truly mattered. What truly mattered was what I was about to achieve, the mission that was about to be accomplished. True victory wasn't about proving something to others, but about accomplishing something much greater, something no one else could understand, but which, in the end, would prove the value of my choice. The moment this secret mission began to unfold, I knew I had fulfilled my role. I was no longer a lost soul, no longer a deserter, as many had labeled me. I was now part of something bigger, something that would have a profound and irreversible impact. And by completing this mission, it would not only change my life, but also the way others would view my decision. Because, whether they knew it or not, my departure from the army had been preparation for the greatest mission of my life. A mission that, in the end, would transform everything. The secret I had kept for so long was now revealing itself as the key to my future, and the feeling of fulfilling my purpose gave me a quiet peace. I was in control of my own story, and the journey everyone thought was over was just beginning. In the days that followed, after the secret mission began, a new phase of my life began to unfold. What had previously seemed like a retreat, a defeat, now revealed itself as a strategic action of great magnitude. But while others saw my departure as a sign of weakness, I knew I was about to prove something far more important, not only to others, but most importantly, to myself. The stigma of being seen as a deserter was still etched in the minds of those who knew me, and it didn't disappear overnight. All those who laughed at my decision, who judged me as weak or incapable, were still somewhere, waiting for me to fail. The pressure to prove I was right, that my choice had purpose, was immense. Every step I took on the mission field, every move I made, I knew I would be watched, and the eyes expecting my failure were ever present, albeit invisibly. It was at that moment that I realized the true magnitude of what I was doing. It wasn't just about fulfilling a military mission, but about proving the value of the decision I'd made. When you find yourself labeled, when your choice is discredited by everyone around you, an internal pressure builds, a need to prove you have what it takes, not only to win, but to overcome the limits imposed on you. I knew my mission wasn't just a strategic one. It was also a way to reclaim my own dignity, my autonomy, and most importantly, my right to be seen for who I truly am, not by the stigma of failure imposed upon me. During the first days of the mission, there was a constant fear of failure. I didn't just want to complete what was asked of me. I wanted my choice to be recognized as the courageous and strategic act it truly was. I wanted everyone who had doubted me to see the value of my decision in the end, to understand that it wasn't a surrender, but a preparation for something much greater. This drive to succeed, to show others that my decision had purpose, fueled me and propelled me forward, even when things seemed difficult. The mission wasn't easy. Every step required precision. Every movement was crucial. The adversities multiplied with each passing day. I knew the others were waiting for me to fail, hoping my decision was just a mistake. Every obstacle in the way, every challenge, was another test of my ability to not only complete the mission, but to prove that my choice had been valid. I wasn't there to be the best in the army, to be a traditional winner. I was there to prove that my vision, my decision, was more valuable than any label they had placed on me. As the days passed and the successes began to accumulate, one thing became clear. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The mission was being successfully accomplished, and the results spoke for themselves. The personal satisfaction of seeing my strategy working, of knowing that the decision I'd made was producing concrete results, was far more rewarding than any external applause or recognition I might have received. I knew I was on the right path, and that, in the end, was what truly mattered. But the true victory wasn't just in the mission's results. It was in the way I began to see myself again. Overcoming the stigma of being seen as a deserter was a painful but necessary process. Upon completing the mission and seeing the impact it had, I realized that the true test wasn't what others thought of me, but what I thought of myself. The mission was my way of redeeming myself in my own eyes, of showing myself that, even in the face of so much adversity, I was still capable of achieving something great. And most importantly, that my departure from the army wasn't a mistake, but a strategic move towards something much greater. As I reflected on the journey thus far, I realized that this mission wasn't just about the practical results, but about the transformation that had occurred within me. Before I could be a soldier, I needed to be a whole person, someone capable of rising above adversity and moving forward with honor. I no longer needed the army to validate my existence, and I no longer needed the approval of others. I had already proven, silently but undeniably, that my decision had a purpose greater than any judgment I might receive. When the mission was successfully completed, and the truth began to unfold, I knew this was the ultimate victory. It wasn't just that I had accomplished the task with precision, but that I had overcome what seemed like a defeat. I was no longer the person who had left the army in disgrace, the deserter everyone expected to fail. I was the person who had proven, without words, without shouting, without explanation, that my choice was valid. And looking back on all the moments of doubt and judgment I faced, I saw that the true victory was my transformation. With the mission complete, the stigma overcome, I understood that the journey was never about external validation. What truly mattered was the value I placed on my own choices. I no longer needed anyone's recognition. I had proven, especially to myself, that I was capable of achieving what I set out to do, regardless of the difficulties or the opinions of others. The secret mission wasn't just a military task. It was the key to my redemption, the way to reclaim my honor and dignity, and to reconnect with what truly matters, my own vision and courage. With the mission's success, the stigma of failure disappeared, and with that, I was able to walk in peace, knowing that no matter what others think or say, the most important thing was that I knew, and always had, what was behind my choice. I had finally proven my worth, and that was more than enough. The moment the secret mission was completed was undoubtedly a milestone in my life. Although most people didn't know what had happened behind the scenes, the operation was an absolute success. What seemed like a failed military exit actually turned out to be a brilliant strategic move. With each step of the mission, my confidence in my decision grew. But I also knew there was no turning back. The weight of responsibility on my shoulders had never been greater. For me, the outcome of this mission wasn't simply the successful completion of the established objectives. There was something more, something invisible but profound, that allowed me to feel that somehow the journey was greater than anything else I'd ever experienced. The impact of this mission, which few would ever understand, was being shaped by the consequences I would face next. Although I managed to accomplish the mission with precision and efficiency, I knew the repercussions of my choice would begin to be felt later. It wouldn't just be the mission's success that would be celebrated, but the consequences of that choice. The army wasn't prepared to understand that, despite having left, I could still contribute significantly to something greater. The people around me, those who saw me as a deserter, could never have imagined the crucial role I had played, and this rendered me invisible again. However, deep down, I knew this invisibility would be temporary. The decision to leave the military to pursue a classified mission wasn't just about the work I'd done. It was about redefining my self-worth and how I saw myself in the world. I'd been seen as someone who'd lost the right to respect, but in the end, I was able to look within myself and realize that my true strength lay not in the words others spoke, but in the actions I silently took. As the results of the mission began to emerge, I began to realize the true consequences of everything that was happening. Although people didn't know the details, the effects of my choice began to be felt on different levels. For some, my departure was the end of a story. For others, the beginning of a new phase in which they began to see the true impact of my decision. But despite the mission's success, something else began to become evident. The weight of being the person everyone had once believed to be a failure, but who was now being silently acknowledged, began to generate a mixture of contradictory feelings within me. The pride of knowing I had fulfilled my duty, but the sadness of realizing that not everyone would be able to understand what had happened were conflicting feelings. I wasn't looking for applause. I was looking for something deeper, self-acceptance and proof that my choices had been valid. That mission, which had seemed like just another secret hidden in the shadows, now became the main point of reflection for everyone who knew me before, and even for myself. What seemed like a failure, a wrong decision, an irreparable mistake, became a profound learning experience, and I knew that, somehow, this would change the course of things. Not for me, but for the world around me. The consequences were no longer about what people thought of me, but about the impact of each action taken toward my goal. I had not only accomplished my mission, but also done something few would be able to accomplish: change the course of history without anyone knowing. Over time, the answer to my mission became clearer. It wasn't about immediate success or the acclaim I expected. It was about building a legacy, however silent, that would go deeper than any external recognition. The consequences of my choice began to shape my future in unexpected ways. Although no one knew exactly what I had done, my actions began to create changes in the environment I had left behind. I knew the fruits of this mission would begin to blossom over time. It wouldn't be an instant victory, but rather a gradual building of my worth. Every move, every small action I took, was bringing to light the true consequences of my decision. I was no longer seeking approval, nor did I need people's validation. The true reward for me was the understanding that I had done the right thing for myself, without needing immediate recognition. The mission had been successfully completed, but the effects of this would be felt for years to come. The story of my departure, the story that many had mocked and ridiculed, now became something that would change the course of my future. The people who had judged and labeled me could no longer deny that I had done something important. Though no one knew the details, the impact of my actions was beginning to manifest. And in the end, I knew that the greatest consequence of my choice was the transformation it wrought within me. I was no longer the person everyone expected me to be. I had reinvented myself, not to prove anything to others, but to discover my true purpose. The mission's outcome wasn't limited to its immediate success. It was a testament to how, when you follow your heart, the greatest challenges and greatest rewards often lie on the path less traveled. I had won, not because I was shown the right path, but because I was willing to walk in a direction few would dare. And now, looking back at the outcome, I knew that every step, every sacrifice, had been worth it. The true consequence was becoming the person I was always meant to be. When I look back on all the moments that led up to this point, I realized that the journey wasn't just about the tangible results of the mission, or the recognition I sought, but about the internal cost of doing what was right, even when no one else seemed to understand. I had made the hardest choice of my life when I decided to leave the army, and in doing so, I left behind a part of myself that everyone expected to see: the perfect soldier, the one who would follow the traditional path and stay within the limits imposed by a rigid structure. But the real choice I made, and the true cost of everything I experienced, was not my departure itself, but the sacrifice of my own identity, the internal battle to be true to who I truly am, even when it meant swimming against the tide. Throughout the entire process, the dilemma was never between right and wrong. The dilemma was deeper. Would I be able to do what I believed was right, even if it meant being rejected, mocked, and misunderstood? The cost of following my heart, of leaving behind my military life to pursue a greater mission, was heavy. I had to face a loneliness I never imagined I would experience. I was alone in a sea of doubts and voices trying to convince me I was making the wrong choice. I knew deep down that the mission ahead was important. But how could I convince others of this when I myself didn't know how the future would unfold? As the mission progressed, the pain of the adjustment process and the initial insecurities began to transform. The feeling of being wrong in the eyes of others didn't disappear immediately. The looks, the comments, the judgments that echoed when I made my choice were still there, reverberating in my mind. I didn't know if I could live with the weight of the personal cost of doing what I knew was right. The world was telling me I was failing, that my decision was foolish. But the real pain didn't come from others. It came from within myself, from the constant struggle to convince myself that what I was doing had a purpose, even when everything seemed uncertain. The true cost was the constant doubt, the incessant need to prove that my choice had meaning, because, in the end, it wasn't about what others thought, but about what I thought of myself. The cost was the need to surrender a part of myself that was deeply rooted in others' expectations. I needed to convince myself that what I was doing wasn't a failure, but a necessary change. And to do so, I had to sacrifice momentary peace for the inner conviction that my mission, however silent, was something grand and crucial. In my mind, the battle wasn't just about the mission's success, but about rebuilding my own identity. When you're forced to walk away from what you expected your life to be, when the path you choose defies all expectations and suppresses judgment, the true test isn't external, it's internal. The true cost is what you lose of yourself by trying to do what feels right when everyone around you doesn't understand or even believe you have a reason for acting the way you do. That's what was eating me up inside. The feeling that by leaving, I was leaving behind not only the army, but a version of myself that could never be reclaimed. But the biggest lesson I learned throughout this process was that the cost of doing the right thing isn't always repaid with immediate recognition. In fact, oftentimes, this cost is invisible to the world around us. The rewards aren't always instantaneous, and this was a test of patience. The things most worth achieving are the hardest to achieve, but the true reward comes from what you achieve within yourself by facing challenges, by overcoming obstacles while remaining true to your essence. The cost of doing the right thing isn't measured in titles, applause, or external victories. It's measured in the power of living with a clear conscience, in the power of knowing that the mission you chose to fulfill was more important than any recognition others might offer. As the mission drew to a close, and the true impact of my choice began to unfold, I knew I had done the right thing for myself. I no longer needed validation from others because, throughout this entire process, I had regained confidence in myself, in my ability to make a difference, to fulfill my mission without needing public recognition. Looking back today, I see that the true cost was the learning experience. The learning that, often, we need to step outside our comfort zone, challenge expectations, and swim against the current to achieve something greater than others can comprehend. The cost was my own transformation, the construction of a new identity that doesn't depend on the opinions of others, but on a commitment to my own truth. The value of that? Incalculable. And in the end, I realized that the true cost of doing the right thing, of taking the most difficult and challenging path, was my ability to grow, to reinvent myself, and to understand that the greatest victories don't always come with applause. Sometimes they come in silence, in the certainty that you were true to yourself and fulfilled your purpose, even when no one else believed in it. The true cost of following what is right is precisely the strength to be who you truly are, regardless of the judgments or difficulties you face. This is the greatest victory of all.